Welcome to Pod of Jake, a podcast hosted by Jake. You can go to zerofjake.com to learn more about Jake and everything that he does, and feel free to email him anytime at jake@blogofjake.com or message him at zerofjake on Twitter or at Jake on Warpcast. Anyway, we thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode. If you do, please consider giving Pod of Jake a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support.
Thank you, Winter, for joining me on the podcast today. I appreciate you taking the time. You are the co-creator of BasePaint at BasePaint.xyz. This is a collaborative pixel art project. You've been building in crypto for quite a while, and you've built a number of different interesting projects, but I think it's safe to say that BasePaint is the one that has sort of hit and resonated with people the most. I think it's super cool. I've heard it described by people as the most fun thing that they've ever done in crypto. And right now, if you're, watching this podcast on YouTube and seeing the video, or watching it anywhere and seeing the video, you'll actually see the screen share is basepaint.xyz as it appears now. And what you see there is people are all sort of contributing towards, painting this piece of art with their, you see those cursors moving around. They're all sort of adding pixels and working on the piece of art for the day. And then so after it's done, it basically is available. People can go and mint an edition of this piece of art for 24 hours. And after the 24 hours, you can't do that anymore. And you can only buy them from people who bought them during the 24 hours on sort of secondary markets. So it's a really interesting project and definitely like very unique versus, there's a lot of sort of crypto projects, NFT projects in general that are sort of, they kind of look a lot like one another. And this is something that felt pretty distinct and pretty different. So really respect what you've done here and excited for the conversation. I think the best place to start would be for those who, aren't familiar with BasePaint or don't know you personally, if you could, sort of share your story from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today, and maybe talk through some of the decisions you made along the way.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks for kind words. I think you've done a really good job describing what BasePaint is. My pseudonym is Winter. I'm a software guy. I learned to program when I was 16 without having a computer. So I got some books from my cousins about Turbo Pascal and a bunch of other sort of old tech stuff, and was just so excited. It was fascinating to me that you can type these commands into a machine and the machine does the commands and then something comes out of it. Eventually, I did get my hands on a computer, and while most of my friends were playing Counter-Strike or other sort of early games, I was coding. I was coding my own games. I was trying to build some things. And then, tens of years later, I worked at big tech for a while, actually. Worked at startups too, and now doing my own things, including BasePaint and other projects. So that's a quick, I guess, overview.
Yeah. So what ultimately gave you the confidence or conviction to move on from like big tech and startups and sort of get more deeply involved with crypto and ultimately I think crypto, you're full-time crypto at this point, right?
Yeah. So I always wanted to have my own thing. Even at big tech, I used to work on the 0 to 1 projects. So somewhere where, the team almost doesn't exist. There is a faint idea of something. That to me is the most exciting stage. I love the ambiguity. I love this very dynamic, fast-paced process. But as big tech gets bigger and bigger, the room for these projects is smaller because most of the work is maintenance or politics, getting, And I'm not saying this in a bad way. Like, there is a lot of hard work actually to get a bunch of people aligned on something and doing something in the kind of cohesive direction. But that's not the types of projects that give me a lot of energy. So I kind of transitioned off to a smaller startups, and now I have my own stuff. As for the crypto side, I have my old friend who we used to work at big tech company reach out to me in the summer 2021, and he was like, "Hey, dude, help me out with this NFT thing." And at the time, the only thing I knew about NFTs was from Hacker News, and it was very negative sentiment, some scammy things. And I very, very distinctively remember that day I open up a thing he wants me to copy or like build a project similar to that one. I look it up. I look at in the source code how it works, and then it leads to this, 42 character hex number that I punch in, and then I get to Etherscan. I'm like, what is this thing? And then I go to the source tab, and then my mind is blown. Like, that to me was such a revelation. Like, I saw the blockchain idea in that sort of simple contract. I understood the value and the novelty and why it's so cool. Because, before that, I knew about Bitcoin and it's cool ledger stuff, but you can't really do too much with this. You can transact value, and then there is some rudimentary VM that can do things, but nothing like the Ethereum smart contracts. And when I read that Solidity file that day, I was just blown away. And then, after that, a week later, I was hacking on that project. I remember staying up late, past midnight, trying to like squeeze in a few bytes of optimization to submit my contract on chain. The prices were up to like, deploying a contract costed like $500 or so. So every byte counted. And it really gave me these teenager vibes when I was, 16, learning to code or getting my first computer and just being super excited about the tech. Not, the subject that everyone else was focused at the time, games, for example, when I was 16, or financial values when I discovered blockchain, but actually the tech part, I found it so elegant, so awesome, so novel, and so restrictive in a creative way. So ever since that day, I keep thinking about interesting projects that can fit into this model, and how it's better than what we have so far. And yeah, that's I guess that was sort of the pivotal moment for me, in terms of like getting my feet wet into the um crypto space. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you say like, Ethereum is sort of restrictive in a creative way. It like sort of reminds me of, basically constraints can be really useful, like they're limiting technically, but then what can occur within them can become sort of like better than what could have been done with no constraints in a sense. So like Twitter is a pretty good example where they limited the character count like very small, and then this thing that was like, previously like sort of blogging was a thing, but then, what was originally called like microblogging, and we now just sort of know as like Twitter, became this like huge thing by actually taking away optionality, and like you can't write as much as you could with blogging, and that turned out to be a lot more popular. So can you speak more to like this sort of restrictive creativity that you saw in Ethereum, or what you think it is that's sort of interesting about what can and cannot be done with Ethereum or blockchains at large?
Yeah, so constraints are liberating, right? They, before that, doing lots of projects for big tech, like the compute gets bigger and bigger, cheaper and cheaper. So essentially, the upper bound on what you can do is very high. I guess AI nowadays makes uh, kind of steps up to that challenge and shows that, hey, hardware actually can be a limiting factor, but outside of AI, most of the things you could do on your laptop. Um, and there is very little sort of constraints in that. The blockchain is much more restrictive, right? Like the amount of things you can do there is sort of much less, but they are guaranteed in a way that other tech doesn't guarantee. So that to me was sort of one of these key moments when I realized that, NFT contract specifies, for example, how many open edition items or NFT items you could have in the collection. And that is like hard coded in the contract I was viewing. And I knew for sure that means that even the author of the project cannot expand that. They cannot make more NFTs of the same kind because those will be different NFTs. The code has been burned into the blockchain, it's been confirmed many blocks afterwards. So, statistically speaking, there is almost zero chance of that has ever been undone. And, that to me made a lot of sense, is that you could actually program constraints into your system that can't be changed even by yourself. Like, for example, let's say you are building an online store and you are selling some digital goods. You could say like, hey, I can only sell 100 of these books, but it's a lie because you can always sell more. You can always increase, change the database value, redeploy a service, etc. But with NFTs, the beauty that I saw is that, these limits they're hard-coded into the system. And then to your point about constraints, the other sort of direction that I saw, and that was found by Loot, was that Loot was the first time I learned about this. Then I found some documentation and blog posts about people who've done similar things before that. But Loot still is a NFT collection where all of the data is stored on chain, which means each NFT has an sort of metadata link, and that link points basically to itself, and the link itself encodes all the data that is needed. And to me, that was mind-blowing. It was like you have this self-contained system. It doesn't depend on any other servers or anything. And it was even more challenging because you can build NFT and store images or videos on your servers or IPFS or anything, and that doesn't provide much constraints. What I kind of saw and started exploring was this on-chain NFTs, that all of the metadata of that NFT was stored on the chain as well. And yeah, that provided a lot of sort of interesting iterations. I've built libraries to kind of make it easier. With my friend, we did a NFT collection of watch faces, which was very high fidelity sort of things we could do within these constraints. And yeah, that was fascinating. That was at the time where the NFTs kind of were at its peak, and usually just technically not very interesting. And that was the saddest part to me, which was I was seeing the depth of the technology, what it can do, and the interesting creative constraints it imposes, and then seeing most of the projects that by most people were deemed successful, exercise none of these constraints, was kind of depressing to me and weird. But I see, I came around to this and I understand the value now more, but to my geeky self, I'm kind of somewhat disillusioned with the industry not using what it can do and not innovating on that front. Yeah, but to this day, I feel like Ethereum is a great sort of example of a very well thought out system that has really cool constraints that are not too restrictive, but also not too free. Yeah, really enjoying using it and building for it even still.
Do you think that there's a sort of a reason that you can figure out as to why people are only sort of like leveraging certain limited aspects of what the technology is capable of and sort of not using others? Is it because the others aren't, as practical or maybe intriguing to an audience for some reason? Or is it that they're harder to implement or anything like that? Or is it hard to say?
No, so we have to follow the value, right? Like the value of the Bored Apes NFT is not in its technical achievement. It's not in the artistic quality of the work. It's sort of the value is in itself, in the popularity of the NFT and its price. And that's sort of a weird, self-referential one, but we get a lot of people nowadays that are celebrities because they are celebrities. They haven't done anything in particularly, outstanding, but they are famous and they are getting even more famous because they were famous. So, I can see that, humans are drawn to this sort of value more than a technical value. And from the technical side, you could say like, hey, maybe during Renaissance or other sort of older times where you look at Japanese art and say like, hey, that was very sophisticated. The type of like color pigments that they used, the sort of the technique, you could say it's very advanced or very hard to replicate this image. But, that is a value that some people see in the technicalities and others see in the just the aesthetics of it, and they maybe don't care too much about the technicalities. And I think with time I came to appreciate that part more because these big collections like Puji's and others, they have figured something that most companies in the world haven't, which is distribution and attention. Like that's the ultimate currency of any project. Yeah, they used the underlying technology in a very, very, very limited way just to get something out. But the core innovation and core value resides elsewhere, and that's fine. People are willing to appreciate it, willing to pay for it, willing to transact with it. Yeah, I still like that in the Ethereum, like in my early days, I found this underground Discord servers, places where you have to be invited to and can just join, because most of the Discord servers at the time were, just exploding with communities, in quotes, discussing things and hoping for airdrops. But there were a few sort of very hardcore dev communities that I was very lucky to get access to. And that was my sort of crew where they were discussing this geeky sort of limits of tech, how to do this or that, how to, discovering different projects that encoded full images on chain or use some interesting token dynamics. And that spawned a lot of ideas that I've spent, months and maybe years thinking about. And some of them culminated in projects, others are in my notebook of projects that are just collecting dust. But, there is definitely an audience of people who appreciate this aspect of tech.
Do you think it was the sort of like technical differences with what like sort of the way that you set up BasePaint that differentiated it from some of the other projects you've done? Because you've done like more than a handful of other projects prior to this. You mentioned watch faces. There's like Snow and Runes and Button DAO, Button.lol. These were projects that you had sort of like taken, like you said, your perspective that most of the people that were doing things or most of the projects in crypto, like without any sort of like disrespect, they were more so sort of like doing more of the same on the technical front and trying to win on the distribution front. Only so many of them actually sort of succeeded in that. You mentioned like Bored Apes and Pudgy, and the distribution, like you said, is like really hard. If you can capture that attention, like that's you kind of win. And it's not an easy thing to do. Otherwise, everyone would do it. But you sort of had these interests of like different pieces of the technology to play with, and you experimented, several times with several different projects. Do you think it was partly the sort of technical combination of the way that you designed BasePaint that set it apart from these other projects, or were all of them roughly like as technically interesting to you, and it was more so just sort of the formula for attracting attention and distribution that set BasePaint apart, if that makes sense?
Yeah, great question. I think one like BasePaint is less hardcore than my previous projects. Like the pixels are stored in on-chain events, which is fine, but they're not stored in the storage that is more expensive, but that could have allowed us to do like on-chain renders and stuff like that. So in that way, it's a little weaker, I guess, but for good reasons. Before the blobs upgrade, storing these pixels was very expensive on Base. But when I was building BasePaint, I think the Web3 tech really made a lot of sense. First of all, it allows me to keep myself honest. Like the contract between the project and the artists who participate is written in, formal Solidity code. And that means that I, as the author of the project, I cannot rag artists. I cannot take away their earnings. So if somebody is painting on BasePaint right now, and then, they I decide they are evil and really bad. I cannot take the money that they've earned through this system and take it away. Like that is encoded. And that for me is extremely important. First of all, because that's basically the core principle I operate. It has to be ethical, like it has to be very solid. And then on top of that, it means that even if my keys from admin of that contract leak away, nobody can rug these people out of their honest sort of work that they have done. So to me, that was extremely important. And then on top of that, I've tried to put on-chain as much as possible. So like what you see on the BasePaint.xyz website is basically a reconstruction of the data that is on chain. We don't store anything outside of the chain on that image. Well, we store palette, I'll get to that. But technically you can, if the BasePaint XYZ goes down, you can still reconstruct the image from on-chain data, which I think is really cool. And Nader, who just joined us after a few months of BasePaint, he messaged me and Zach and kind of got in touch. And while we were discussing this, he was like, "Oh, this is really cool. I discovered that all these pixels, they're actually on chain, and I could like query them and render them." And it's like, he saw that beauty. And to me, that was very, motivational, that some people appreciated, but most people appreciate the outer side of the BasePaint, which is the front, right? The images that they see, the artwork, which for that, I'm infinitely grateful for our most talented artists kind of coming in, showing up every day and painting and making beautiful art. Like they really set the project apart. But from the technical side, again, based on my principles and technical purity, the contracts that I've built for BasePaint are immutable, so they're not upgradable. And after several weeks of launch, I started to regret that because I've noticed there are a few things that I wish I've put on chain to help things out. Like, for example, we saw a big problem with brush squatting, where after a few weeks, bots have figured out how to snipe brushes when they appear on the website and basically resell them at a much higher markup. And then, we came up with idea of themes and palettes way after the launch. So that was not encoded on chain. And, if the contract was upgradable, I could have included that as well. So, I feel like with BasePaint, I took a more flexible mindset. And I have some regrets about it, but I do stand by my principles of, I mentioned not being able to rug the users and sort of the idea in the contract encoding all the data that is needed to reconstruct this artwork later on, even if for some reason the main website goes down and things like that. So, I feel like with that, I did some compromises. And we've spent, Zach and I have spent a bunch of more time thinking about distribution and thinking about this like two-way marketplace building, which has been very beneficial. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so hard. Like you mentioned the positive aspects of you not having control. Like you literally can't rug the artists. The artists every day they're contributing to the work, and the next day it gets minted and by a bunch of collectors, and then the artists basically earn from the proceeds of the mint, proportionally to how many how many pixels they were responsible for. And there's nothing that you guys can do about that. Like you can't, it's all sort of like hard coded, like you said. And then the thing is though, like, that's a great thing. Like you don't have to trust you can, it's, verifiable, and it's set in stone. But the flip side of that is, this point that you're making is that you have to sort of, if you're going to sort of set everything in stone or set a lot of things in stone, um, you have to be able to foresee the changes and flexibility that you're going to want to, like the changes you're going to want to you're going to want to make, and the flexibility that you're going to want to have in advance. And that's just like an impossible thing. Like the whole, you talked earlier about like sort of loving operating in like the 0 to 1 phase of building things. And one of the big sort of aspects of operating in that stage is that you have to just like sort of put something out there and keep iterating. Like you can't foresee exactly what's going to work, what's not going to work, how people are going to receive things. etc. And somehow with crypto, in a lot of contexts, including a project like this, you have to somehow try to foresee as much as you possibly can in terms of giving yourself that like future flexibility without, compromising on sort of the main things, such as like your ability to, change the economics or things that we talked about earlier. So
Yep. No,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. This is very spot on. And to be honest, like the geek in me really likes this constraints, right? Like it means that I have to ship it. I have to think about the sort of implications of everything from this contract design to the distribution and UX and everything else. And
Right.
that is what makes blockchain different and kind of interesting to me, because in typical backend dev, right, you have a full stack app, you can change parts, right? Like you learn and you iterate and you kind of fix things up. And the worst thing that could happen is that maybe you need to do a database migration from one schema to another, versus here, you kind of have to exactly think ahead. Obviously, this is not required. And now that I look at these things, is that you could structure a project in seasons, for example, on some other way where it gives you this iteration thing. But that's the sort of the power of blockchain that is underappreciated, I think, is that it can fix things in a way that typical backend cannot fix. And by fixing, I mean not solve, but like make them basically in stone, right? Like as you mentioned, just kind of describing this economics or these rules of the system in a way that cannot be altered even by the authors of the system, which, to me is this like amazingly freeing idea.
Yeah, and I think there's, at the end of the day, there's the positives that we talked about, there's the negatives that we talked about, but overall, I think I view it as a positive just because um, it's to your point, like it's sort of a it's a difficult challenge to foresee as much as you can, but that's like a challenge worth having. It's like sort of a respectable challenge, and the imperfections then from like a lack of foresight sort of can add to the appeal of a project almost. It's like could have never foreseen like that thing, but like that's part of what makes it cool now. And
Mhm.
like sort of there's sort of like things that might be viewed as like faults can become maybe positives or bugs can become features in a sense. So I think that's pretty interesting. And I want to sort of like discuss two particular things. I think we've kind of covered, at least at a high strokes level, like the basics of how BasePaint works. But I'd love to sort of discuss a couple of particulars that I understand were things that like sort of almost didn't make it, at least into the original sort of like launch. But ultimately, like you worked really hard to make them happen because you felt they're important. And one of those is what we're looking at now, which is, well, really both of them we're looking at now. One is how you can see like sort of these live cursors that are, doing the work on the art. And then the other is sort of this live chat on the right. And I think the combination of both of those things just really takes this page, which like most pages on the internet, I would not describe as particularly like alive. Like even Twitter, it's alive in that you will get new content if you, refresh it and like, there's if you keep scrolling, it kind of scrolls forever or, TikTok, it's got these videos and whatnot, but like there's a different form, I feel like, of aliveness when you see people like actively painting how you do now. So I'm curious like what went into this sort of, live cursor element and the chat and sort of the thinking behind that and the implementation of it.
Yeah, good question and good highlight. Like it indeed, this feels like a living place, and it feels like a place you can go and things are happening there, and they're happening. Sometimes they're slow, sometimes they're faster, and yeah, there is beauty in there. So I guess this is basically me and Zach kind of jamming on Figma and conceptualizing BasePaint a year ago. And Zach kind of, when he outlined the structure of the app, he put a chat on the side. And he's like, yeah, dude, I know that, implementing chat is such an engineering hustle. It's probably going to take a long time, so we'll probably not do it. And I just read it as a challenge. I'm like, wow, this is, I let's see how long it's going to take me. And then I analyzed a bunch of online projects that I could drag it, like basically implement chat. I found this, my friend actually started a company called Cord, and they were building these things as interaction tools. And basically, I pulled their SDK, integrated the thing in like while waiting for my kids to get dressed in like maybe 20 minutes or so. And it instantly, I felt something like it transformed the space to something alive. And Zach kind of logged in and typed something, and like it, I can't emphasize how big of a change that became. It just shifted the thing. And then cursors was like just an extension of that. The funny story around this is that the first version I used, I think it was live blocks to power cursors. And they had a free trial, and then there was some pricing that I just didn't have time to figure out because we actually got started on this project less than 10 days before its launch. So we were very much on a very tight schedule, and Zach was handling a new baby coming to their family, and then I struggled with some work stuff, so we didn't have that much time to do things. And I pulled in this live blocks thing, which was, to their credit, very easy to integrate. And then we launched, and then I looked at the billing maybe 2 days later and saw like a 4,500 bill for just like these 2 days because it was based on the unique users or whatever they made the billing. So I had to redo it. It's a simple service that basically tracks your cursor and transforms the relative to absolute coordinates, etc. But it was kind of trivial to migrate it. But indeed, it added that sense of aliveness to the space. And one subtle happy accident that I want to highlight is that you see the cursors show up and they click on things, but you don't see what they are clicking on. And that's because what you see on the screen is basically the pixels that have been committed to the chain. And the things that are in progress are not shown here. They're only sort of in the local storage of the author. And the interesting thing that I've noticed myself, and then kind of interviewed a few people and saw the same kind of pattern, is that they show up on the website and they see that it's kind of living. They see the cursors doing something, but they don't see what it is. So they stick for a little bit. And then if they stick for, long enough, something will appear. So there is this sort of expectation and delight that you can get out of this process of observing this cursor. Is like, oh, you see somebody's working somewhere like up on top of these mountains. I wonder what it is. And the only thing to know is just like hang on this page and wait. And once they commit, it will propagate to the canvas, and you're like, oh wow, that's what they've been working on. And this little problem, I would say this is, if you pitch this to a PM in a big company, they will say, oh, this is a problem, right? Like this is not what users expect. But I think it adds some level of interest and delight and suspense almost. You're like, what is going on? What, or maybe you see two cursors and you're like, oh, holy shit, something is bad is gonna happen. They're gonna overlap or something. And you start thinking more about this experience than if you just see the pixels live. So Zach and I have talked about bringing in like work in progress to this page, so you could see like an overlay of what everyone is working on, and we'll see, if we end up integrating it or not. But even in this form, I think it already provides some delight to the users.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually. I've seen it happen a bunch, and there's something to it. Like I don't know the exact psychology, but basically, if you were to see them every pixel that they paint, it would be maybe more interesting in the moment, but you would have nothing to wait for, like sort of the delight that comes with seeing like a full piece of the painting appear at once would be sort of like, spread over many smaller moments. And I think it's probably, like, all things equal, more pleasant to get that, sort of burst of delight once in a while than sort of a constant little drip, which is like sort of, there's no sort of like milestone in a sense. Like it's just consistent progress, and it's probably not as interesting or enjoyable to watch. So I think that's really interesting. And it sounds like that was maybe one of these things that, like you said, at big tech, they might have considered it a bug. And it's like something that you needed to like work harder in order to like make quote unquote better. but actually in this case, like sort of maybe the easier implementation is the better implementation. And I do get what you're saying. If there was a way to like sort of, intentionally select to watch individuals' progress, that could be interesting as well. But I do like the sort of incentive of waiting around and sort of waiting for a big piece of the art to sort of like populate at once. And it also sort of gives one more lever, I feel like, of creative control to the artists who can decide when they want to save everything on chain, basically. Like they can do small pieces and save it a lot, or they can do one big piece and try to like, impress anyone who's sort of there to see that moment, which is kind of cool. So there's a bunch of sort of interesting elements there, I think. So maybe you could speak a little bit to how the without the paint itself, like there's the artists who are painting it in, but there's the template which they're painting in the first place. Maybe you could speak a little bit to how that's selected each day. I know it's sort of a democratic thing, and how those, how the options are even, exist in the first place, and then how also like the artists are selected, like the people who are painting here, like who are, some of them are sort of more real artists and like sort of established artists, others are more so, parallel to like just regular kind of users. So if you could sort of like get into some of the details on some of those pieces in terms of the template and the artists.
Yeah, I'll start with the artists if you don't mind. So I think this is one of the sort of the hard problems of building in crypto is like getting users. And because the field is such as it is, a lot of projects are scammy and very artist hostile. So it was kind of a challenge for us to get a bunch of artists. Fortunately, Zach knew a few people, and then I knew a few people in these underground discords that I posted. And we recruited them for a testnet launch a day prior to the main net launch. And most of the stuff that came out of it was I made it so that Canvas flips every hour instead of every day. And most of the pictures were some dummy things or pictures of genitalia. Basically, that's, majority of this 1 hour days were. And, we were concerned that that's what's going to happen to the project. But fortunately, we've done a lot of uh, basically cold DMing people on Twitter and other places where we would give a pitch to the project. Most of the people will ignore us, but some people stick around, try testnet, and some people knew me from Twitter following. And piece by piece, we kind of gathered a bunch of audience that we felt was very solid. And one thing that we've noticed, which was really cool, was that basically we still got spammers, but these spammers actually help the community because they come in and attack the canvas and draw some project names or some silly things on there. And the artists who are more sort of, conscious and with better intents, they defend the canvas and they like either overpaint or undo what they do, or even jam on what they did and create something beautiful out of it. And that created a really strong gradient between like us versus them. It's like, oh, we're not the people who ruin the canvas, right? Like we're the keepers, we're the sort of the taste makers and things like that. So like that created a really cool community where the chat helped as well, where they coordinated, fixing the canvas and things like that. And with time, as the project proven itself, I think Numa was the first one who made the tweet that he basically out of his first couple of weeks earnings, he gained like $20,000 or $40,000 on fees that he earned as an artist on this platform. And that suddenly flipped the table where, we got a lot of people interested and coming in and wanted to get a brush to participate in the project. So that has been really, really helpful on the artist side. And again, we will be forever grateful for all the artists who are joining and helping make the canvas what it is. Because if you look at other projects that are like open field, draw anything you want sort of projects, they usually regress to something that is ugly or advertisement based. So we are very fortunate to kind of see this community, holding strong bar of quality, even with the canvas increase and colors increase and stuff like that. And then as far as the guidance goes, again, this is something that Zach and I haven't thought too much about before the launch because we're such a tight schedule. And as many projects, our expectation was that like if we get 100 people drawing something on this canvas, that's a success. And we didn't actually think about the long term, like, what happens after day one. And day two flipped, and then it was the same sort of canvas, and we didn't know like what prompt to give. So we came up with a theme idea, and then I changed the color palette a little bit for that specific day. And then it actually like this worked. So every day we now have a different theme and a palette. And it creates a totally different thing for artists. It's interesting because every day they come in and it's something new, right? Like something sometimes challenging, sometimes boring, sometimes something that they wanted to draw, sometimes something that they hate. Like it creates this variation. And then so we hard-coded a bunch of theme colors and theme names, but we were creatively depleted after I think day 14 or day 20 or something, where like we just ran out of ideas. So we did some voting with Prop House, but that was very slow because it was like a week turnaround time. So we basically built voting into the thing, and that I think really elegantly completed the loop between collectors, artists, and production, and because we made it so that anyone can vote on the theme and anyone can suggest the theme, but the weight the vote has is proportional to the amount of canvases they have. So it's quadratic voting. So if you have one canvas, you have one vote to assign to a theme. And then if you have, 100 canvases, you have 10 votes. So that makes the NFT that people mint kind of utility NFT. Now they can do something with it. They can vote on the themes, and it felt fair and interesting because now the collectors get to say what artists get to paint. And then the last challenge was with the palette, and that was a weird one. Like if you look at the gallery early days, we had a bunch of sort of palettes that maybe me, maybe Zach came up with that didn't work as well. Maybe Mario, for example. Like you can see that it's kind of washed out. The colors there and outer space as well is too contrasty. So we still didn't know what we were doing. And what we realized that the palette is actually very important because if it's not contrasty enough, if it's not interesting enough, no matter the theme, it all kind of falls apart. So what we did is that we started hard coding the palettes, but we give people the ability to vote on the theme. And that was actually a really cool mix because the stuff that really matters for the artist, which is like a good color palette to make something just from the artistic perspective solid enough, I guess. Plus the theme prompt that kind of triggers them. Each one has a different take on it, and sometimes themes are event based. Sometimes they're sponsored, sometimes they are, proposed by artists or by collectors. And it's interesting, they reflect the shape of the universe at the time, right? Like people were obsessed with this crypto crash or this, this event or that event, or there is solar eclipse or things like that, kind of represent a state of the community at the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just sort of like, scrolling for people to see, some of the things that you were talking about as you were talking about them, the voting over here. And, there's 6 themes here that people can choose from. And I think it's great that you did the quadratic voting. You obviously didn't have to do that. You could have done something similar, like, every canvas that you own is equal to a vote. But the quadratic, I think, is interesting for a reason. Obviously, it's been, talked about in the Ethereum world for a while, but rarely, implemented in ways that are actually useful. So I think that's super cool. And then also sort of refining the palette selection over time. You know, we looked through the gallery at some of the older pieces, and I think you can pretty clearly see like there's been basically improvement in the palette selection on average, I would say. It sounds like that's been as a result of sort of more intentional selection. Yeah, I think another interesting piece, you sort of have talked about, you know, how you sort of acquire those early artists basically just through like sheer persistence of like sending a ton of messages and, you know, not getting a lot of responses, but fortunately getting enough from, you know, quality people that you were able to get started. And then afterwards, when it became public and, you know, more widely known how many people or how much ETH people were earning from contributing, more artists became interested and it sort of became more of a flywheel. But in terms of like getting more people actually just on the website beyond the artists, you know, collectors, I understand that like a big part of the success and the strategy to date has been through partnerships. And some of those partnerships I think are like in direct, you know, correspondence with the partner, and others are more so like sort of inspired by, even if the people sort of it's inspired by aren't directly involved. Can you talk a little bit more about like sort of how this sort of like partnerships approach and how that's been sort of a powerful lever for growth for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is I think the first partnership was Kevin, and that was suggested by Coinbase, and it really made sense. We didn't think about it before, but sort of the goal of BasePaint here, you really highlighted this well, create that flywheel. You know, more minters means more revenue, means more artists, or better artists means better art, means more minters, right? Like it's sort of a flywheel effect, and it's always top of mind on our end is how do we get artists paid and get them paid more, and partnership come in this with currently they are all manually handled. So projects reach out to us because they've heard of us and they've heard that we do these things sometimes. And we figure out what makes sense. Every project is different. Usually the deal structure is that the project is committing to maintain, you know, a certain amount worth of canvases, and then they get to set sort of the palette or the theme name. But we work with the brands to create the palettes and the theme name that is not sort of directly just that brand, because the artists don't know what to paint and it comes out really, you know, it's hard to be creative in there. Like with Kevin, for example, that was just general direction and people draw pictures of it. With Lens, we called it Lens Garden, and it looked really cool and, you know, flowery. With Party DAO, it was also like party theme and using their palette. So we try to customize this in a way that makes sense, and then the partners get, you know, exposure. They get the mind share. I think kind of a side note, but BasePaint, like its impact is relatively small if you look at the crypto. Like the amount of volume we've done in just sales or even secondaries is nothing even close to like bigger collection on Ethereum's or L2s or other L1s, right? Like it's really tiny, but I feel like its most impact is in the heads of people in crypto that do matter. Like people, the best people I know in crypto, they have heard of BasePaint and they use it as a sort of almost on the same level as Nouns or some other projects that are much bigger sort of treasury wise, as a model of what crypto could be and what, you know, what is so interesting about it. So you know, that mindshare and that brand value is why partners want to partner up with us, because they're like, oh, you know, that's a good thing for crypto. You know, we have marketing budget. Let's have something. And it's super interesting to us because the artists get paid. And even with our portion of mint fees, we usually either mint even more of this or invest in something else. So it all sort of goes back into the ecosystem and this flywheel. So yeah, really excited about the partnership we've done so far. Some very big brand names. and still very much crypto related, right? Like one thing I guess you haven't asked, but I want to plug is that like we're thinking of how to make this accessible to people outside of crypto, because I actually have every 100 days, I print out a metal 2 by 2 feet painting that has all 100 canvases on it and put it in my office. And everyone who visits there just blown away. They stand next to it for like 10 minutes sometimes, just like looking at these pictures and finding something interesting in there, because there's just so much detail. And I wish we had a better way of telling this story outside of crypto. It's like, hey, there's hundreds of random people all over the internet coming in on this website and painting together every day, right? Something interesting. So that even in itself, outside of the crypto realm, I think is an interesting story that we want to get out. But for now, most of the topics, most of the sponsorship of BasePaint are crypto related.
Yeah, I think it's so tough to crack the code on reaching people outside of crypto. Like obviously people have sort of been incrementally coming into the crypto world and coming on chain over, really 15 years if you're talking about Bitcoin, less with everything else and, more sophisticated projects, people building on Ethereum and whatnot. But it's just hard, especially when you're just trying to build something in crypto that works. The most likely people to sort of get it and participate, at least at first, are going to be crypto natives, people who you don't have to sort of convince on the crypto side of things. And then once you make something that appeals to them, it's not trivial to say the least. It's really hard to figure out like, okay, how do I actually go beyond that? It's hard enough to get the crypto people sort of involved with everything that's going on in crypto. And there's just like this, even things that are super successful for a day, like the challenge is, sustaining that success over, multiple days, let alone weeks and months and over a year. And that's one of the most impressive things I think with BasePaint is like you guys, you had this initial burst of success sort of launching around the same time as Base. And then, subsequently, days after the launch, it's less traffic, but then more traffic and more traffic. And then now we're like over a year later, day 394, as people could see on the screen if they're looking, and like people are actively painting like all the time and people are actively collecting every day. And so that sort of staying power, I think, is pretty unusual. And the next challenge, to your point, is how can this reach people who are less either in crypto or tangential to crypto, and just people who might just kind of the types of people who would just appreciate the art on your wall. Can we actually get them sort of like on the website and involved? And it's just a difficult problem to solve. So one other, and feel free to, comment on that, any other comments you have, but one other thing I'm curious about is sort of how you designed this sort of economy, if you will, of, how much of the, like how long, the mint is for a day, the proceeds go split between the artists proportional to what they painted and some to the protocol, and like how you sort of thought about designing these different things, especially since you had such limited time to do so, and like why you think maybe it's worked so far, that people are sort of like the incentives seem to be correct enough that everyone who's gotten involved has sort of like continued to be involved. And obviously there's a piece of it that's just the project is like enjoyable, but at the end of the day, if you have like really wrong incentives, even the best project in the world is like sort of gonna die out pretty quickly. So I'm curious how you thought about sort of the economy of it.
Yeah, I mean, Zach, who is the co-creator of BasePaint, right? Like he's been designing, PMing for probably 20 years, and I have been coding consumer apps for maybe about 20 years. So there is a lot of intuition that would come into this. So I think it was maybe like 5 minutes of discussion that came up with this model, right? Like we were looking for something to do. Like there were a lot of ideas we explored, and then we had to trim them down a lot. And then we kind of jammed on each other's thought just a couple of rounds in, and it was clear. It's like, oh yeah, this is it. Like this is the flow, this is how it kind of loops around, and this makes sense. And yeah, so it wasn't like controversial, or it didn't take us too much of a time to kind of design this. And I don't want to over attribute this to our sort of ability to build these things. Like we got lucky very much in, in the fact that Base launched at the same time, and we used this wind to propel the project forward. We were lucky with the first artists. We were lucky with the creators. We were lucky with the collectors as well, them willing to take a chance in this project and kind of mint these things and explore. So, a lot of this is luck. A lot of this is community as well, like the staying power of these artists. I know for a fact that a lot of them still paint because they've made friends over, these hundreds of days painting together with the same people and kind of jamming on each other's style. They've learned a lot, but they kind of feel there is a kinship environment. And I feel like even if all the incentives kind of were dropped, these people would still stick around for some time, and just for the joy that they extract from interacting with each other. But for sure, this model of creation and then capturing value and distributing it back. Lots of crypto projects keep talking about this, but it's all in such an abstract, and it usually comes down to basically, liquidity provider fees or something that is very much sort of trivial and gameable. And I've seen some communities that operate on this model that are relatively successful, but it's not, a blueprint that most projects can just follow, unfortunately. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I think, you're talking about all these decisions and how you guys implemented things, and you gave credit to like luck for a lot of things. And obviously, there's always some element of luck, but like a lot of I personally believe, at least, like sort of you in a lot of cases, you have to make your own luck. There's certain blind luck that's sort of like totally not up to you, but for example, like finding these great artists, like they didn't just walk in the front door. Like you had to send so many messages and get so many people who just didn't even respond, and probably others who said no, that like there's more than luck there. That's like clearly large element of persistence and just sort of like shooting your shot over and over again, and caring enough about the project to sort of try to get it a fair look. So I think I don't want to over ascribe too much of this to luck. You guys obviously did a great job. So I want to ask one. I know we're a bit over on time. If you have one more time for one more question, I have a question that's not BasePaint related, actually. But before I ask that, is there anything else on BasePaint that we didn't talk about that you think is worth mentioning?
No, I think we covered a lot. I still have the time, so if you have more questions, shoot away. I don't have a hard stop here. I think you are, you've really done your homework exploring all these different aspects of it. And yeah, again, I just want to highlight how grateful I am for this community that makes BasePaint what it is every day. So, highlight of my day, observing this progress and like making small improvements week over week. So yeah.
Yeah, it's actually, I don't know if, again, for those who are watching on video, just seeing it get painted over a long period of time, there's almost something like sort of meditative about it, that like if you just pop it up in a screen, like, and even if you're not like paying too much attention, we're doing this conversation audio only, so there's not really much for me to look at besides my notes and the base paint of the day. And so it's kind of like having been looking at it more or less for, going on an hour. There's just something nice about it. It's like it's slow, and it starts to look nicer and nicer. So it's kind of this interesting thing. And I think that's the theme of your work, or at least one of the themes of your work, even pre-base paint, is like you like to do things that are genuinely novel and sort of like using the technology in interesting ways that most people aren't using it. And this certainly qualifies as that. And it's sort of like, obviously you had many inspirations. I think you've named a bunch of them, but like the $1 million homepage, or some other things, but it does sort of stand alone as its own unique thing, and that's really cool. But the question I wanted to ask actually about, which is not base paint related, we were talking a little bit before we started the recording about pseudonymity, and I think it's like you mentioned earlier, you've been sort of working in big tech or startups for roughly 20 years. And just in, I think, 2021, you decided to start this sort of new, online identity for yourself, which is Winter or winter.eth. And, it seems like you've gotten a lot out of that, that you've sort of enjoyed this pseudonymous identity. I know, I started my sort of like doing anything on the internet the same way. And I find pseudonymity to be like actually incredibly freeing. And I think a lot of, pseudonymity can kind of get a bad rap, and for good reason. There's like sort of a lot of bad actors who use it for, nefarious purposes. But on the positive side, for other people, my whole thing is like pseudonymity encourages authenticity, because you don't have to worry about like sort of, what people from your past are sort of like going to think about it. Like if you start a pseudonym from scratch tomorrow, like if you're listening and you just go and, create a blog or a Twitter or whatever under a name that's not your own without a picture of your face, then like, no, you're going to be like, talking to the void basically. Like no one's going to care. And you can just like at that point, if you don't have an audience, you're just writing for yourself. Or, in the case of a podcast, like you're talking to who you want to talk to because you want to talk to them and about what you want to talk about. Like there's no sort of outside influence or like filtering for certain audiences that you're aware of that are like watching. Like you're truly starting from scratch. And then it's sort of this opportunity to like sort of build this audience of people from that authenticity, that enjoy what you're doing from that place of authenticity. And then like you end up with this great audience that may be like sort of a lot better, suited for what you do and what you want to do and what you're interested in than like people that you've sort of like randomly accumulated from the first 20 or 30 years of your life. So I'm curious, like sort of how that creation of the pseudonymous identity has been for you. And looking back, I think it's been a few years now, sort of like how you reflect on it all.
Yeah, great question. And you're very, very spot on. Like these thoughts that you just voiced, they didn't come to me immediately. Like I didn't create this identity just because of the reasons you mentioned. Like I just wanted something that is separate from my professional one, because the professional one gets some sort of story, right? Like you could trace the story. Oh, okay, there was this kid, he worked here and there and then made this career and then specialized in this sort of field profession and then got this achievements, did this public talks. Like you could create an image of a person, and then the stuff that I was excited about just didn't fit in there, in that sort of professionalism. And I kind of wanted it separate, but I was more hungry for followers at the time. I was like, okay, I'm gonna build, this following thing. I read some course or some like viral tweet about how to get viral and things like that, and failed pretty miserably about this. I questioned my choices because my other identity would have like more followers, more engagement. I would be like, okay, kind of double guessing myself and having lots of doubts about creating it. But at the same time, as you mentioned, actually having a lot of fun, like genuinely having fun doing things and talking about things I find fun, and not being connected to the judgment uh, in my head of the people who, used to know me. How they perceive these things was very liberating. Like I could talk about these geeky things without caring what other people think too much. And then that was the key, is that like I've learned that a lot of this content production comes down to your mood. So I've heard this story about this Excel girl, a woman on TikTok that was doing the videos about trivial tips in Excel, but she's doing it in the background while dancing on the foreground or something like that. But her secret was not in the content itself, because that one was, relatively like you could read a book and know everything about it. But she described how her day goes, and that just like blew my mind. She would, wake up, do yoga, and then get for the favorite smoothie, and then travel a little bit, and just like try to get in a good mood. And then she listens to her favorite music, gets pumped up, like gets that burst of energy, gets really connected with what really excites her. And then she like produces that content, which takes her like 15 minutes to like maybe half an hour to record these videos. And then her editing team kind of does the rest of the editing and, composition and stuff like that. But and she could produce a week worth of content in that just one day. But the important part is that the excitement that she brings, because when you watch these videos or the content of people who really care about these things, it really comes through. It doesn't matter what words you use, or even if you make like grammatic errors or you have accent like myself or anything, like it comes down to your excitement for the field. And if you're really excited, you can't fake it. It just comes across in a way that people can connect to. And that's why the podcasts are popular. Twitch is popular, YouTube videos is popular, because people find ways to connect to the genuine excitement of the content creators. So yeah, that to me was a huge sort of unlock and revelation. And with time, I was able to build some good friendships on top of that, and participate in some projects. And with time, it gets easier. I remember really struggling, like having all this amazing, quote unquote, amazing ideas about what can be built with smart contracts, and then posting, as you mentioned, them into the void and see nobody care. And then I see, Dom from Loot coming in and like tweeting about a very simple project that in my head was like, oh, just even a 10% of what I had in mind, and just getting this outsized engagement. And it was very painful at the time. But, as the time goes on and you stick to it, you focus on the excitement more than the numbers. Slowly, like people find you and connect to the ideas. And now I have this benefit of having some audience that I can tweet to. And although, we're now at the mercy of the algorithm and not everybody sees what everybody's tweeting. But at the same time, if I'm about to launch a project, I know I can find, at least 10 people who are going to at least try it, which is a huge luxury in this world, actually, because I was starting with having that count equal 0, right? Like nobody cares, nobody wants to try it, nobody knows what it is. So to your point of building luck, I think that's a sort of a key brick in that as well. It's like if you are very much connected to what's exciting to you, and you're producing this content, and people find you, you get luckier in a way. The next thing you do has more eyes or more attention or more people paying attention. And early on in this conversation, I mentioned that distribution and attention is the real currency. And that's where the real value is. And no matter the Bored Apes, I implemented the most simple NFT standard possible, they have that sort of attention paid to them, and that's sort of the key value. So yeah, it can be acquired through, I think pseudonymity is an amazing vehicle for this, because you can actually produce things that you're genuinely excited about, that you don't need to worry about other things. So yeah, big fan of this. Yeah, highly recommend.
Yeah, I think it is so hard at first. There's sort of at least a couple of disadvantages, I would say. And I also, from time to time question why I'm even doing the pseudonymous thing. Because it also, one of the downsides of it, I would say, is that there is sort of extra decision making that needs to be made pretty frequently to protect the pseudonymity. And I'm not like, Satoshi level pseudonymous or anything like that. I don't think you are either. So it's not like, protecting it with like your life on the line or something like that. Like there's, fair number of people who know, I'm happy to generally like sort of meet people I've become friends with through the internet in person and stuff like that. But 99% or 99.9% of my however many thousand, few thousand followers don't, they don't know my last name, and they don't know what I look like. And just even protecting that is like, can be somewhat difficult. Or, just thinking about like what level, like where on the spectrum of pseudonymity you want to be, or you want to sort of like end up, and especially if you think that you're going to do sort of like, big things, which it can sound sort of like, cocky basically, but I don't think there's anything wrong with, being ambitious and believing in yourself and thinking that you're going to do big things and sort of attract significant amount of attention in the long run. And if that's the case, then like these little, clues of pseudonymity that you give away, like along the way, like sort of make a difference on sort of where you end up on the pseudonymity spectrum. And so anyway, there's sort of like significant amount of overhead in thinking about these things. And then also, I think just practically speaking, if you start this new sort of pseudonymous identity, you are starting from scratch. Whereas like you're never starting from scratch with your identity in life if you don't do this. You're sort of born and like you have a family and you meet people and like you accumulate these people, and by the time you're conscious in like, you know, middle school or high school or whatever, you've already accumulated like a reasonably large network, even if it's just like family, friends, or whatever. And that only sort of grows as you go through, you know, college and career and whatnot. So starting like from dead zero is pretty wild. And it's definitely like not fun for a while. Like it's, you are, you know, putting content out, and like you said, it's like good ideas. It's like no worse ideas probably than you have, you know, today, or at least some of the ideas that you had back then when you had zero audience were just as good, if not better, than some of the ideas that you have today. And yet just like zero attention. And there's just like nothing you can really do about it. And then the other piece is I think people just like a face. And probably honestly like a real name. But more so, I think a face. Like if people can know what you look like, it's helpful for building trust, I think. And so for me, like my profile picture has always been, you know, this blue dot, and it's been the same like as my logo for my podcast and my blog. Basically everything I've done on the internet, the only sort of like visual I've given for myself is this blue dot, and there's nothing personable about that. And there's elements to that that I like, is that like sort of if you have your profile picture as like sort of a bored ape or like a mutant bored ape or whatever, like that sort of, you can kind of like assume a lot about a person, and like it might not even be accurate, but that person sort of like getting a stereotype for, you know, if they have like a mutant ape profile picture, they might be like kind of like I don't know, like uh almost like a scary person, or like kind of, I don't really know the best word to describe it, but it's sort of like the picture speaks to the character. And then like if they have like a pudgy penguin, it's like, oh, this person's like kind of like innocent and like cute maybe, and also like they have a decent amount of money because they're able to afford pudgy penguin. And with just like a blue dot, there's like no baggage in my view, like for better or worse. And I like that, but it's also like very difficult to develop trust with that to some extent. So I think there's like sort of a lot of challenges, um, for sure with doing it. And but I think to your, you know, as we've both been talking about, once you sort of are able to get past that 0 to 1, and even if you just have like 100 followers or something, but you actually have been able to like, you know, conversate with some people, it's very cool because these people, it's not just like the people you happen to, you know, grow up near or work with. It's people who sort of, you found each other through the internet based on common interests, and they're almost like the best people in the world that you could sort of be connected to. And then that just starts to sort of compound. Once you get to 0 to 1, you get like, you know, 1 to 2, and realistically maybe it's more like 0 to 100 followers, and then 100 to 1,000, and then 1,000 to 10,000, or something like that. Does that sort of resonate with your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And the it's almost like building a brand in a way. Like you have your avatar is your logo, and that also means that you can't change it too often unless you have other elements that are consistent across the way you post or the way you talk about things. So yeah, certainly. um, and your mutant apes example is kind of interesting because things get outdated, right? Like maybe nowadays, uh, having mutant apes is like, it's not as kind of interesting or as up to date, right? Like if you're
Hmm.
associating yourself to the collection or something like that. So yeah.
Nice. Well, so last question, and then we can wrap things up. But obviously, you're continuously working on BasePaint. Are you spending your time, you know, are you working on other crypto projects or anything, or is it like 100% BasePaint, or even even outside of crypto, or just personally? Like, I'm curious, you know, how you're spending your time these days, like things that you're working on, or just in general doing, sort of like this interesting chapter in your life, which I sort of, I would imagine, you know, a year and a half ago, you couldn't have imagined sort of like your day to day of what you're doing now, or at least it's somewhat surprising. So I'm curious, like sort of what you're up to, and then just in closing out, maybe we can, you know, point people to the best places to go to, you know, follow you on Twitter, or check out your website, and go obviously to basepaint.xyz, which we've been watching this whole time. So hopefully people are familiar there. But anywhere you want to basically send people.
Yeah, so in terms of what I'm doing, like my regular doxed identity, I guess, has a job, has a company, and I'm working on some things that I cannot speak to in here. Winter side of things. I actually have something exciting coming up. But I also can't give too much detail. But I guess my dream job would be building base paints for unlimited amount of time, right? Like if you think about this project, it took us a few, maybe like 2 weeks to get it into a certain shape. And this has been a very durable project. So, I'm wondering like if I spend a year just building projects like this, right? Like sure, most of them would fail, but some of them would be valuable. And that's what's most interesting to me is building applications, something that people would use. Crypto VCs and crypto just in general funds mostly protocol work, a lot of like systems and a lot of promises like, oh, just imagine, if I have with this amazing infrastructure, and then everybody kind of hopes to get all the users, but the users don't use protocols, they use apps. And most of the apps right now are just swapping tokens. And if you look at the core of it, like why are they swapping tokens? Well, because they want to speculate on the value of the token, right? Like that's sort of the app or the game they are playing. And I'm just not interested in that. Like it just doesn't sound exciting at all. I feel like crypto can do a lot more. And that's my hope for the foreseeable future is to basically work on more projects like this, like BasePaint, maybe with the increasing scope and increasing normality. But I do want to build a lot of consumer graded apps. The challenge with that obviously is getting funding, right? If you're coming up with a protocol, it's much easier to sell to and established institutions where they can see the venture scale business out of it. With the app side of things, so far we have been struggling. We've been pitching nouns, we've been pitching some other like private friends, and there are some angles where this makes and doesn't make sense, but it's a harder sell than trying to sell a protocol or a token. Yeah, that's the thing. And in terms of links, I think my ask for you is to just go to BasePaint and mint whatever is on there. Check out the art, like see what people are coming up with, and just think about it for just a moment that what you see is the product of work of a few hundred people all over the world. We have people from Philippines, UK, Australia, India, Turkey, like you name it, like there are probably a BasePaint artist somewhere. And it's just fascinating to see people collaborate. Like, isn't this what blockchain was all about, right? Like having all these people without borders interacting on something permissionlessly in a way that produces something valuable and something interesting. So I hope BasePaint inspires you to build more stuff. Give me a follow if you want to learn more about the projects and things that are coming up on my pipeline. Unfortunately, I can't be more specific about them, but there is definitely something coming up. And yeah, thanks for listening. This has been a really cool chat.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Winter. I really enjoyed it. It's been an awesome conversation, and I'm excited to share with people as well. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time and awesome what you've built. So excited to see, what's next for BasePaint and for you in generally. So thanks again and appreciate the time.